All right. Well, hello everyone. And today I have something very special, which is I get the chance to talk to somebody who honestly has quickly become one of my favorite booktube channels, which is Jay from A Contemplative Reader. So, Jay, if you mind, like giving a brief introduction as to who you are and what your channel is all about.
Sure. Thanks, Sam, so much for the invitation to come on your channel. You were quickly one of the ones that I identified as being of like mind, even though I think I'm considerably older than you, so my mind doesn't function quite as well as yours these days, I'm sure. But um, yeah, so I am a long time. My first career was as a lawyer. As of actually yesterday, I've been a lawyer for 30 years.
Hmm.
Mostly retired from that. And about 15 years ago, I was ordained as a pastor in the Lutheran Church, and so have served small rural congregations for the last period of time. But my brain has continued to want to be engaged by learning, so I've continued to go on to various continuing education and spiritual direction from Benedictine sisters at a monastery. I just finished a master's degree from a seminary in the Eastern Catholic tradition, and studying early church theology, mystical theology of the
Sure.
Eastern perspective. And so as soon as I hit submit on my capstone research project last fall, I'm like, it's finally time for me to enter the booktube sphere, because I've been lurking for a long time. And I thought, I want to read something for fun.
Yeah.
So, and I had noticed that there were some people who offered reviews and analyses of fantasy and science fiction from a spiritual perspective, but perhaps not from the perspective that I might have to offer. But then I started discovering your videos, and like, well, I think you pretty much have everything to say. I'm just sort of footnoting what you've already commented on, I think.
Well, that's definitely not true. Well, I'll say this, Jay. So I'm trying to remember how I first came across your videos, because it was the first one that you uploaded that I saw, and immediately I was like, oh, like this is great. This is great stuff. So I'll put the plug in here right away. Like if any of you haven't subscribed to A Contemplative Reader, I'll obviously have them linked down below. Go check them out. Great videos. But most of the time when I have other booktubers on, I don't have the charisma of a lot of other guys who can just talk for like 2 hours and just keep a conversation going. So usually there's a topic. But with your stuff and the perspective you bring to what you read, I was like, even if I can't come up with something, we'll just call this like how to be a contemplative reader. Because I want to pick Jay's brain both about your background and also like what you like reading, because I think there's a lot of shared interest there. And then maybe some of your process of reading. And then recently you read a book that I actually recommended, which was Pirate Freedom by Gene Wolfe. So I'm sure that'll come up as well. I'll say like most people watching my stuff have probably heard me say like my only professional education is I have a bachelor's degree in biblical ministry. So Jesus stuff, faith stuff. I'm sure that'll come up in this conversation. So if people aren't interested in that, that's fine. There's plenty of booktube stuff that does not cover that. But because Jay has a more well thought out and mature perspective on many things that I'm still interested in, I was like, man, I'd love to talk to him about it. So I guess, yeah, you mentioned you've worked on booktube for a while. Your style and your perspective is very different from a lot of people. You're not doing top 10 lists or here's every Augustine reference in Thomas Aquinas. Let's see if we can spot them all. So, like, what was kind of your thought process when getting going?
I think as I watch channels, I mean, certainly like Philip Chase was certainly somebody that I started watching early on, right after he started, and he was offering an intellectual perspective and an analytical perspective, much like A.P. Canavan was doing. And then, but I wasn't seeing specific references to, like I reread Eye of the World, first book in The Wheel of Time, a few years ago, and The Great Hunt. I actually have stopped there. I can intend to go on at some point in the Wheel of Time. I think if I remember right, you bounced it book 5 or 6. But I'm going to keep going, hopefully at some point. But I was picking up, Robert Jordan was a traditional Episcopalian, but also had experience in studying Eastern religion.
Right.
He was very familiar with Buddhist philosophy, for example, and Eastern philosophy. And I was picking up things that I'd never, as many Wheel of Time things are out there. I wasn't picking up people who were talking about that. I was picking up examples from the Episcopal liturgy that he was fitting in to a narrative, much like, I mean, Gene Wolfe is like that on steroids, obviously, from the Catholic perspective. But I think that's kind of what I thought that I wanted to do on BookTube, is do those kinds of dissecting, sounds too analytical, but deep dives of the way fantasy and science fiction writers, particularly, I'll get into other kinds of literature at some point, have integrated spiritual and religious references into their writing. And so when I discovered Gene Wolfe, I had no idea who Gene Wolfe was. I have an interesting anecdote about Gene Wolfe that I'll bring up at some point in time later, but not to be distracted by that. I never heard of Gene Wolfe personally until BookTube, and I started seeing, I think Philip was starting to read it, and some of the other folks were reading it as of a few years ago, Fantasy Network and others. And so I thought, I want to get to that someday. So I read The Shadow of the Torturer last year.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, this was made for me.
Yeah.
And then when I reread it after starting my channel, that's when I was really able to, again, I had my old legal notepad out, and just virtually every page I was writing down, oh my gosh, he's referencing monastic prayer times. He's referencing, okay, here's some obscure saint name from, of course I had to look at it, but as has been commented, virtually every human name in there is connected to a saint.
Right.
So, just doing research on that and how does that relate to the story. But yeah, even other books. So the Discovery by the Mintons, I found there's a wealth of information, or a wealth of religious and spiritual world building that they put into their story. It seems like there's my cat. I'm invading her space right now. Her litter box is right over here. So yeah, that's really why I wanted to join the space and have conversations like this. Because again, as so many other booktubers have commented, in my daily life, I know pastors and I can talk theology with.
Right.
I perhaps know some people who are interested in science fiction and fantasy, but that the mix is kind of the Venn diagram on that is pretty small.
Right.
But on BookTube, sky's the limit. So there's people like you and many others who seem to show an interest to it. But I don't want my channel just to be for people who are into religion. I hope to bring something to offer to others as well.
Well, because it's, how would you say this? Like you come at things when you talk about it from, it's not necessarily an academic perspective as much as it is like the perspective of like I don't know, like a teacher, So you're not here as like proselytizing or anything like that. So like you said, even if people are like maybe not from the same faith perspective, I think there's still a lot of value there. Like even as you're talking, I'm like, dang it, Jay, like Wheel of Time is behind me. Don't get me interested in this again. Like I got 10 books off my TBR. I can't afford to pick it back up. But you're right. Like there's from what is normally an atheistic genre, like science fiction, there's some weird spiritual stuff that will just pop up. I know you've covered Lovecraft a bit, but like Paul Anderson has a novel that's about evolution called, at least I think it's about evolution, called Genesis, which the cover of it has like two figures in like clothed in white looking at an ape. So it's like there's like some Adam and Eve imagery going on. It's like, what? Michael Moorcock wrote a time travel novel about Jesus, and Robert Heinlein wrote a science fiction novel about Job. It's like, what? Like, some of these authors are explicitly like anti-religious, and so it's bizarre that there's these things that they're just playing with or fascinated with. I mean, the now disgraced Neil Gaiman, I think, is one of the people who was just did fascinating things in some of his books. I'm not terribly interested in completing his bibliography anymore, but some of the ones that he wrote were like American Gods is, at least to me, fascinating. So
right. Yeah, I think, yeah, that kind of what I would call the more classic era of sci-fi and fantasy, other than Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien's an obvious exception to that. Yeah, they were writing. They certainly incorporated those themes in their work, but they were doing it not from an explicit perspective of faith himself. It was more just they knew about traditions, whether it's Christian or otherwise, and just integrated the story. Sometimes, as a foil or a antagonist. The big. I know you've commented on this, the trope of the Catholic Church sometimes standing in as the big bad institution.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting away from that to some extent, hopefully. But regardless, it was there, and I think it's still, there's still a lot of room for discussion on that. So I'm hoping that that's what folks like you and I can continue to do as we dig deeper. And I want to get back more into, of course, I grew up reading Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and those guys, and I want to get back into that. But it's been 30, 40 years. So it's about time for me to get going on that again.
So, because you mentioned something a few minutes ago that got me thinking, you're right. It's kind of odd to pick sci-fi and fantasy to a certain extent. I'd expect somebody from your background to be like, well, we're going to look at the spiritual themes in Dostoevsky, or, we're going to, theological breakdown of, I don't know, Dickens, Hunchback of Notre Dame, what have you. So is it simply a matter of personal preference, or do you think that there's something that science fiction and fantasy can do that classics or literary fiction maybe don't touch?
Two thoughts on that. One is the personal, and then personal perspective, and then I think I'll get to your latter point. The personal perspective is, as a farm kid growing up by myself in a remote rural area in the late 1970s, what did I have? I had Star Wars movies, but I only could watch in a theater. Couldn't didn't have cable TV or a VHS yet. That didn't come till several years later. But I had the comic books. I had the movie novelizations by Alan Dean Foster and Donald Glut and others. Star Trek. I had, and Conan. Books. Those were all the rage in the late 70s, early 80s. And then I picked up, the local, it was back in the day, and you go to the local Kmart or whatever, and on their book rack, there was the Ace paperback series of Conan the Barbarian, those 12 book series of Conan. So I just started picking those up, and that's what I had to do. So it's really what I grew up in.
Sure.
And, Star Wars, of course, and this has been talked about by lots of people, so I won't belabor it, but there really is such a mystical quality to Star Wars, and particularly that original trilogy, which was my era, of course. The idea that there is this force, that envelops us, and that Yoda puts it so beautifully, of course, and The Empire Strikes Back. I think that those kinds of things always interested me, and of course, that's not explicitly Christian, but it certainly is something that captivated me as a kid. And so those stories, those things have just always been of interest to me. So as to more general, beyond my personal perspective, I think fantasy, particularly, I mean science fiction too as well, but fantasy in particular gives the author the ability to explore the other, as I like to say, the mystical, the otherworldly, the spiritual, those things that are beyond metaphysic beyond
Yeah.
the physics, those things that are not defined by the five senses necessarily. Those things they can play with in a world that they've created. They can bring elements of our world into it, elements of our world religions, elements of our science and spirituality, but then they can take it and create their own world out of it. And I just think that that's fascinating. And I think no other genre besides fantasy can do that.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, were you say something?
No, I was just saying, at some point in time too, I'd love to have, whether it's with you or Philip or others too, I'd love to have more of a conversation about this phrase I keep hearing, transcendental fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have its own label yet per se, like grimdark or others, but that's definitely the kind of thing this captivated me about the genre. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, and this is something I talked about with Philip at some point. I don't remember which discussion it was at, but fantasy has sort of an odd origin where, if the grandfather of fantasy is J.R.R. Tolkien, a devout Catholic, then the great-grandfather is George MacDonald, who was a Scottish preacher and by at least many modern evangelicals a heretic through and through. Although I mean, even his theological stuff is fascinating to read, even though it's very atypical from, like I said, modern maybe fundamentalists. But maybe that's a good thing. And then you have C.S. Lewis, who's a devout Anglican. And so it's interesting. You have like sort of this core at the beginning. And then from that, like you have occasional people like Walter Miller, who's a Catholic, and the aforementioned Gene Wolfe and Fred Saberhagen. And so it's not like there's nobody of faith, but by and large, it becomes more or less a secular genre. So what's your perspective? Because one of the authors that you've emphasized quite a bit as having read and liked his stuff is Lovecraft, who's not just not a man of faith, but is almost explicitly anti-faith at the core of his belief system. So as somebody who disagrees, I would assume, disagrees with his worldview, what's kind of your perspective in analyzing something like that and enjoying it as well?
Yes, Lovecraft was certainly no person of religion or faith, at least in the classic sense. But what I think his writing offers is, again, that sense, and it was a bleak imagination at times, existential dread, all those terms that get thrown out with regard to his writing. But he was still imagining a world beyond our world. What if there's this strange place in the ocean where Dagon, this ancient sea god, lives? It just brings in fascinating little elements of mythology, of this kind of otherworldly thinking. Still, his stories are still imbued with that. So even though he was not somebody that would go to church on Sunday or read any kind of read anything remotely like what I like to read for theology or nonfiction stories, I still think he brings in that sense of, again, what is beyond our knowledge. There are other mysteries in the cosmos that our finite, limited brains can only scratch the surface of. And so when anybody is scratching the surface in a manner different than I can, I will enjoy reading it. So even though Lovecraft is certainly of a different mindset than I am, he's still somebody that I want to get into his mind and figure out, okay, what was causing him to go down the path that he did. Certainly some dark paths at times, but very interesting ones. And I think his unique perspective, is valuable 100 years later, and that's why he's quite frankly, much more popular and well known now than he was during his lifetime by far. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, and certainly his disciples are much more numerous now. Probably the primary one being Stephen King. where it might not be obvious how much of an influence Lovecraft is, but like if you listen to him talk or you read some of his maybe not his most famous books strike you as like, oh, this is Lovecraft, but like it was very much influenced by him. And in movies you've got Del Toro, obviously, who's very much influenced by the eldritch horror, creatures from the sea, tentacles, what have you.
Right. Right. Right.
So that's interesting.
Yeah, I need. I've read a smattering of Stephen King. I've read this a long time ago. I read The Stand. I've read Carrie. I've read some of the Bachman books. But I need to. I'm sure like it sounds, just from what I know of the story and having seen part of the movie a while back, that just sounds like something that, as you get into the world building that King does around that, it sounds like something that if Lovecraft were around today, that's something like he would write, perhaps, or at least be influenced by. So yeah, I could see that for sure. But yeah, now of course there's even more explicit. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds like it's something I really want to read. The Fisherman, can't think of the name of the author, but it's definitely a cosmic horror, Lovecraftian influenced. So anything that's exploring that, even from a dark place, I think. Again, one of the things I just to bring in a faith perspective again, faith involves lament and hope, darkness and light, all these dichotomies. And I think when we only explore, goodness and everything's coming up roses, I think we don't appreciate what our world really has to offer.
I want to get back to that too, especially. I'll stick with Lovecraft for one other second here, because whether it's King or Lovecraft or a few other people that we've mentioned here, even if they don't believe in God, which is not it is not a being exactly, even like, I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion of how to define God.
The Eastern Orthodox, I love the Orthodox. They call it the being beyond all being.
Yes, that's there you go. Even if they don't believe in the highest embodiment of all that is good, true, and virtuous, there is still a willingness to put into at least fiction stories an embodiment of all that is evil and dark. So it's interesting to me that even if somebody like Lovecraft or Stephen King maybe won't explicitly claim a belief in God, there's almost an acknowledgement of an existence of, well, they won't call it the devil, but they'll certainly call it evil, or the greatest embodiment of evil in their work.
Right. Another, I know Stephen King wasn't the biggest fan of the Shining movie adaptation with Jack Nicholson, but I there was another movie I watched as a little kid, and wow, well, first of all, nightmares. My goodness, I can't believe I watched it. You're 12 years old, but my goodness, the idea that this hotel is just imbued with this force that not in the Star Wars kind of a way, but this spirit, just haunts this place for centuries, and shows up in the manner that did is I just love that kind of thing. Even though it's coming from a different, obviously not a happy place.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned this a second ago. You said that not all stories can just be about the light or just be happy-go-lucky all the time, and that we actually miss something really important if that's all that we look at. So there are some faith traditions that would say, the Apostle Paul gives a command to keep your mind on things that are true and virtuous and of good report. So, like, why would you read something like, whether it's Lovecraft or even Wolfe? I know other people of faith who say, I won't read Wolfe. It's just too dark for me. Whatever, different strokes for different folks. But from your perspective, what's kind of your take as far as grappling with the darkness of the world from a position of faith or belief? Specifically through fiction?
I think there's another angle to get at the perennial question of theodicy. Theodicy, of course, being the question of why does evil happen? Why do bad things happen in the world? Why do people get cancer? Why do people die too suddenly? Why is there Why is there genocide? Why are all those things? And in fantasy or any literature, but I think fantasy, again, for the reasons I mentioned before, it has a unique perspective on it because of the author can play with their world in a little more. It can become their own personal story as opposed to having to inhabit an existing world. It gives them the opportunity to explore those themes directly head on, and I think that's necessary. I think if you if you, whether in my church I'm just preaching a sermon that's all about well, everything's great, it's all about goodness and love and all of that, which is true, but why is that a counter message then? What is that dealing with? Well, it's dealing with reality. The reality is that, I mean, we all see it, just whether it's in our own personal lives or just by looking at the doom scrolling on our phones, whatever, which I do entirely too much of these days. But it's something that we have to wrestle with, and if we ignore it, it's not going to go away. We have to keep digging to find, well, what is their ultimate reality? Is there a meaning behind this? Mm-hmm. And so, different religious traditions, different philosophical traditions come up with different ways behind it. Of course, in the Christian tradition, that's the ultimate. This is the theology of the cross, that it is through suffering that the redemption of the world has occurred. The Good Friday liturgical introduction to the service, behold the life-giving cross on which was hung the salvation of the whole world. That is at the very heart of our particular faith tradition. But even if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms, I mean, just a beautiful example of, the Psalms aren't just about pray. They're just thanksgiving and praise. There are several psalms that are full of lament. There are several psalms full of direct, why God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And many other examples. So, and of course, one of the whole points of Buddhism, I'm not an expert in Buddhism by any stretch of the imagination, but it's dealing with suffering. It's how to deal with that issue. So I think that fantasy has a chance by stepping into those traditions and offering kind of a new perspective, a new mythos of sorts, offers us a chance to continue to think about these issues and grapple with them in our own lives through stories.
That's interesting. Well, because there's two parts to this. So, or at least 2 points that come to mind. So on the one hand, you have like the typical image of God that a lot of people have when they think of him immediately is the, high and lifted up, the steeple pointing up, he's up there, removed. And the image that Jesus paints is more of one of suffering alongside you, that as we're all children of God, that every child who starves to death and every person who hurts and experiences pain, it's not like God's distance and removed from that, but that he feels that pain and suffering as well, just as a father would for his child that's hurting and suffering. And the second part being that there's an entire book of the Bible that is lengthy and dedicated to debating this question of how God can allow suffering, that being probably the oldest book of the Bible, which is Job. And if you need something a little bit more digestible and within the genre that still asks these questions, Christopher Rocchio's Kingdoms of Death at times becomes almost a retelling or a re-asking of many of these questions in the book of Job, but with alien vampires and space communists.
It's exactly. I mean, I have not read Rocchio yet, but that's exactly my point. I mean, in a world, and I know Rocchio he's Catholic, if I remember correctly. I mean, he gets to bring, much like Wolfe did a few decades ago, he's bringing that he's retelling those stories, exploring those themes anew, through a world that he has created, and inheriting the great traditions of the science fiction and fantasy writers who come before him, but bringing in that unique aspect of his faith background. So I'm looking for. I have not read his stuff yet. I wanted to finish the Book of the New Sun first. I will. So hopefully 2026 is when Sun Eater is on my TBR. And of course, everybody be done talking about it by then, because the final book will have been out, and
That's right.
I reviewed it, and I'll be late once again. But that's
well, for as much as I appreciate Wolfe for being able to do a lot with a very small amount of words, Rakio's not that. He is very verbose and says a lot with a lot of words, which doesn't work for some people. I don't mind, but they are large books, all 7 of them.
Right. So as you mentioned at the beginning, so just this weekend. So yesterday I finished the audiobook of Claw the Conciliator, and today I finished reading Pirate Freedom. So yeah, both Claw the Conciliator, 250 pages roughly, I think. Pirate Freedom's 310 pages, I think, at least in the edition that I have. Oh my gosh, though, they take a long time for me to read and unpack. And I'm going to have to read, before I do a video on Claw the Conciliator, I am going to have to read it again. Like I said, I did it the audiobook this time. Plug for Jonathan Davis, the audiobook narrator. Just amazing job again. Yeah. But I think, I've identified some themes that we can talk about now, or kind of dig into more in the video. But yeah, it's literally every page there's something there. So, and Pirate Freedom, in a very different story, very, very different kind of a story. Although sometimes there's some rhyming going on there between Severian and Chris, and the manner of telling the story and the way faith details show up. So it's still very much a Gene Wolfe story.
Well, like with Claw the Conciliator, you even get, and we'll keep the spoiler free, but you even get a let's say a banquet scene in Claw the Conciliator where it's like, even atheists that I know are like, this seems oddly Eucharistic here in a perverted way. It's like, well, yes.
Right. So yeah, spoiler free. So my thoughts, again, subject to my reread. So in Shadow the Torturer, the 3 kind of spiritual themes that I talked about in my own analysis of it were the monastic background of Severian, which played, I think, such a huge role in his formation and in his personality and his way he was proceeding through the story. Even though a guild of torturers, you don't normally think as a monastic order, but Wolfe was definitely incorporating those elements in it.
Right.
Second, of course, the sacramental aspect of it, and in Shadow the Torturer, it was baptismal. He was, several kind of quasi drowning type incidents, but drowning and coming back to life. And then the transformative element, that kind of dying and rising, and being drawn into a different life than he had with the Guild of Torturers. So in Claw the Conciliator, again, spoiler free, but I think my 3 themes that I've noticed are there is a cruciform shape to the story and an element of the narrative. Again, there was an execution early on in the story that I definitely picked up connections to the Passion story. The sacramental connection, this time, for the reasons you just mentioned, not baptismal so much, but Eucharistic, in a very perverse kind of a way. And then again, also a transformative element to it.
That's right. Yeah.
And I'm going to use some $50 theology words, and I was sorry about that. But it was really an ontological change to Severian. The change in his very being.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons, for some relating to that banquet, some relating to the claw itself, and then time. there's some weird things going on with time in Claw the Conciliator, and he references
Yes.
there's some things that show up. He references in the story, and again, from a spiritual perspective, what I'm picking up there is Wolfe is playing with the ancient Judeo-Christian dichotomy between Kairos and Chronos. Chronos being just the way we measure time chronologically, hours, days, minutes. Then Kairos, these times that are kind of beyond that. How God's time or time outside of chronological time is measured differently. It operates differently. It functions differently. And the way he's telling his story, it's almost in what sometimes is called a proleptic. There's a part of theology called proleptic theology, where things are there's foreshadowing of things to come. It's almost time doesn't start at the beginning and unravel. Time is raveling into a completion. Which is why I think he labeled one of his chapters, the infamous Dr. Talos play, Eschatology in Genesis.
That's right. Yeah.
Eschatology, normally you think Genesis, eschatology.
Right.
Genesis, origins, eschatology, endings. He flips that. Eschatology is first. The end is first.
Right.
Being brought into that reality. And then in Genesis, much like in Shadow of the Torture, where the very first chapter is resurrection and death.
That's right.
He flips those orders around, and whenever he does that, he's getting at something. And that's my theory on. He'll have to go into spoilers in my own video at some point, but I don't know. That.
I predict that Earth of the New Sun, which is book 5, is probably going to end up being your favorite of the series, with just some of the stuff you're talking about there. That's very cool. Yeah. And that's the type of thing that's one of the things that I enjoy about Wolfe, is that on the one hand, like when I pitch it to friends, I often don't lead with that type of thinking. I'm just like, hey, this is like a Dying Earth sword and sorcery fun adventure, because it is that. And also, if you want to dig, if you want to do some looking, it's like, man, there's some real like meat to chew on here. Yeah, right. Like, so.
Yeah, for me personally, I enjoyed. Yeah, there are different ways of reading Gene Wolfe. One is just read it for what it is. Read it, the literal story in front of your eyes. There, what is going on in the story. And I think Shadow of the Torture is enjoyable on that basis. Claw the Conciliator, I had more difficulty with just enjoying the story for what it was. I enjoyed it because I enjoyed digging into the symbolism, as I just yammered on for about 5 or 10 minutes there about my theories. But yeah, I think because of the digressions in the story and some of the weird, the really weirdness and banquet scene, among others, of was just not an enjoyable experience to read. To put that out there on the table, but I enjoyed the way it engaged my brain and made me think.
And in a lot of ways, like, Claw is probably the most unpleasant of the 5 books. I mean, Severian is clearly at his worst behavior, at least so far in that book. When people say they can't stand Severian or he's an awful person, like, usually they're referring to like a 2-chapter segment in Claw the Conciliator, which is understandable. And a part of that's because Wolfe is playing with both the sort of the juxtaposition of like torturer and tortured, savior and sinner within one person. And so because of that, like is Severian a sinner? Yes, and unflinchingly so. And one could say unforgivably so, except God forgives. And maybe there's a path of redemption forward for Severian. Guess we'll have to read and find out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it and getting into the rest of the solar cycle as well, because I know it doesn't just stop there.
I moved it by. I had the book over here for something I was doing earlier today. Just finished up the Book of the Long Sun. And if you read Shadow the Torturer and you're just in it for the dark gothic storytelling and the brooding main character and stuff, then yeah, Book of the Long Sun's going to be really different. But especially if, like what you're saying, Jay, where you're looking for some of the symbolic stuff going on under the surface, Book of the Long Sun is just as rich. I think you'll probably get more of it out of it on your first read than I did, because I enjoyed it, but I'm sitting there going like, man, I'm gonna have to reread this one, I tell you. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you haven't read Book of the Short Sun. You're getting into Book of the Short Sun at some point then, I take it.
Yeah, that's maybe not the next Wolfe thing I read, but in terms of Solar Cycle, Short Sun is next. Yeah.
Right. Oh gosh, it's certainly a journey that he makes. Yeah, on 1 or 2 pages, he makes your brain hurt more than about any other writer of any kind of genre. Yeah. Much less science fiction or fantasy. And that, so Pirate Freedom, very different story, but also is getting you to think along the same lines. You know, what is he getting at? Again, he plays with time, in that story in different ways. I had to read the last, again, spoiler free. I had to read the last page I just read it this afternoon. I read it 5 times. I think just, okay, what? Okay, I get the general gist of what's just happened here, but how in the world did this happen? Yeah, what a great finale.
Yeah, so I was gonna put off. I was going to talk about that later, but this is actually a great segue. So let's talk about, if you don't mind going into more of your thoughts on it. I've read a bit of Wolfe that's outside of the Solar Cycle, and some people who read New Sun tend to pigeonhole his writing style. They're like, oh, it's very, and they describe the writing style of New Sun, but it's pretty diverse. Like, he'll change it up depending on the book that he's writing. But Pirate Freedom is eerily similar to the same style that Severian writes with. But Father Chris in Pirate Freedom is such a, like, he's a similar type of figure to Severian in that he's both spiritual and very much like a sinful character. And you even have like some of the how to put this tastefully, some of the sexual symbolism that Wolfe uses is almost inverted, where like people complain about like female sexual violence in New Sun, and that's almost flipped in Pirate Freedom. With, I mean, I'll let the viewer put together what that, like, it's pretty obvious what I mean by that. Right. But anyway, yeah, like, just I could ramble about it, but I'll let you at least start. Jay, what'd you think of Pirate Freedom?
I mean, I enjoyed it. Did I enjoy it as much as Shadow the Torturer? Probably not. But it was I never read a pirate story. I don't think. I've seen Pirates of the Caribbean and familiar with pirate stories. But these aren't pirates that run around going "Are matey," kind of stuff.
Right. Like slave traders and privateers and kidnappers. Yeah,
he tries to be very historically authentic to the reality of piracy in the Caribbean, and so I think it's just an interesting story. Basically, a straightforward pirate story, but with those weird.
It starts with time travel.
Starts with time travel. Yeah, exactly. Like in the first couple of pages there. As to the spiritual themes, my initial reaction, and again, I've got lots of things that I want to. I think I'm going to have to process it a little bit more before I do my own review on it. But it strikes me that whereas Book of the New Sun is Wolfe's mystical theology, it's an experiential theology. It's a book that very much reads like a mystical experience almost, for the Severian's recounting. Pirate Freedom is more Wolfe's reliance on moral or ethical theology.
Interesting. Okay.
And what I'm getting at there is what I just kept coming back to in this story is Wolfe was just writing in through Chris, very much a situational ethics statement. Okay, so he's a pirate. He's faced with this particular challenge. This is how he's going to deal with it. Violence, it may involve violence, murder. It may involve mercy. The way he deals with slaves sometimes involves, for obvious reasons, the whole subject is troubling. But he seems to have definitely a merciful quality to it. The sexual stuff, you've kind of already alluded to that, but I just kind of kept picking up how Wolfe. I mean, again, whether it's Wolfe's own opinions or what he was just putting into the character of Father Chris. And the controversial, and I did listen to your review of it again. One of the controversial passages when there's a flash forward to the present, and Father Chris is in a meeting about of priests and the bishop about the sexual abuse crisis, and Father Chris is basically saying, well, it's too bad these parents didn't teach these kids to fight back, kind of thing. Obviously, the controversial part of that story. But again, I think that goes to the situational ethics that Wolfe is kind of putting into this story. That there's certainly a overall Catholic moral theology that overrides the story of this priest, but it also is very much dependent on the situation and what the characters, Chris and others, are faced with in the moment, and what they're dealing with and how they deal with it. Kind of to use the old saying, do something first and then ask for permission. Do something even if you don't without permission, then ask for forgiveness later.
Right.
There's that kind of continuing thought process of Father Chris that he had to do what he had to do, but he trusted in God's mercy anyway. Mm-hmm. That's what I was picking up out of it.
Well, because the whole book, and you kind of just alluded to it there, the whole book is written as, this is my confession.
Right.
Like I'm writing, which is this is one of the most interesting openings to a book I've ever read. I just pulled it up here. Father Chris opens and he has a couple of introductory lines in chapter 1 here. And then he says, okay, I read whenever I can the lives of good and decent men and women who sought God and found him. I am not like that. Either I have never lost him or I have never sought him. When you read this, you can say which. I have already confessed many times, but I think sometimes I ought to tell my story. I'm no autobiographer. I was just the only one who knows it. Which isn't strictly true, because even as he admits right there, God also knows it. And so there's a certain question of, there's always that question with Wolfe of how reliable is the narrator? And it's almost a meme at this point. But that question of really only God knows the truth in this situation. And there are going to be readers, Father Chris is probably going to be about as divisive as Severian in different ways. But there are going to be some readers who can root for him and follow along and empathize with him. And there are some people who are going to, after a few chapters, be no, screw this guy. I don't care what happens.
Right. Oh, yeah. There's some trouble. Not in the exact same ways as Severian, but there's some troubling stuff going on in there that this protagonist, priest no less, is acts that he's doing there. But yeah, there's one point later in the story, he just flat out admits in addition to all the stories that I've written about here, I've murdered, I've stolen, I've done all this, da 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 da. And just sort of matter of fact, he says, well, I was a pirate. What else do you expect me to have done?
And this is why I think Pirate Freedom is such a good compendium book to New Sun, not just for dealing with maybe some of the controversial stuff that people take issue with in New Sun, and sort of seeing Wolfe address that in a novel, but from a different perspective, but also because, just like Severian, Father Chris is both a deep sinner in the sense of he's a pirate, but through the entire novel, from page 1, he bears the name and image of Christ, because one, he's a priest, and we know that from the beginning. But two, his name is Chris, which is, comes from Christ. So throughout the whole story, there's a certain element of bearing that image while he commits these sins. So I don't know what to make of Pirate Freedom. And of all of Wolfe's novels, it is not one of his better known ones. There's almost no scholarship or discussion about it out there. It's not been touched much by some of the like Alzabo Soup or Mark Armini. So
right. When I was looking for, when I was finishing it up this weekend, I looked for other commentaries, reviews on it, and your video, maybe 2 or 3 other videos out there on YouTube, no podcasts that I could find, and then a few like Reddit threads or something like that. That's all I could find on it. So hopefully this discussion in your review, and when I get around to doing my review, that will cause people to, because I think for his, this is the first story that I read from Wolfe's later period.
Mm-hmm.
Been written in 2007, but I think to me it's an example of he's still got it.
Yeah.
I maybe wish he would have. There were times I thought the story didn't interest me as much when he was, I think he was showing off his engineering knowledge and as to, in applying that to the way ships and other things work, and then the love triangle type aspects of it. Sometimes I had a hard time okay, who's he having the relationship with now? Although it was kind of like Severin, the person he was looking at the moment captured Father Chris's interest just as much as Severin's, apparently.
Yeah, no, that's true. Like, and I'll give a brief digression just because it's funny to me. So Brian Lee Durfee put out a review of this like a month ago or something else at the time of recording this, which is cool. Like, I liked hearing his thoughts. But the only other review before then, there's this guy, and like, God love him, he had never read Wolfe, just picked it up because he thought it was a pirate adventure, and it's the funniest thing to watch him just be flustered of like, what the hell did I just read? Like, what is this novel? And so I've like the guy's review, I've rewatched it. It doesn't have many views, but like I've rewatched it like 4 or 5 times because it just cracks me up. Him being like, I was expecting Jack Sparrow, and instead I got like Severian the pirate. Like, what is this?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Johnny Depp would not be a good Chris. No.
Now, I have to ask, since we're talking about like symbolic authors, what is your history, if any, with, or have you read any Tim Powers novels?
I have not. Again, he's another author that I had not heard of before BookTube, and then I see that you and I think the Talking Story and other people.
Yeah, he just read one of his. Yeah.
Yeah. It started to show up on my radar. So. Yeah, that sounds like another guy that I need to read pretty quickly here.
So Powers, Powers is like, he's a contemporary of Wolfe. He was actually very close friends with Philip K. Dick back when Dick was alive. And Powers is still alive and writing today. He's got a novel coming out this December from Baen. But he is not as confusing as Wolfe. He's not as how would you say it? As obtuse or like mind bendy as Wolfe can be. A lot of what he writes comes off very much as just like, here's a pulpy, weird fiction adventure novel, often written in the style of like a secret history novel. So like, here's the facts we know, but secretly behind the scenes, here was a horror thing or a sci-fi thing that was going on. But his stuff is as deeply symbolic as Wolfe's stuff is. It is fascinating to read. So like, in almost every novel that I've read of his, the main character, and I'm trying to remember where I first heard this, that it was pointed out to me. I think it may have been Aaron, who runs the podcast I Might Believe in Fairies, who talks about sci-fi and fantasy from a Catholic perspective. And Powers is his favorite author. I think it was him that said that in every Tim Powers novel, the main character is protected or saved at a critical moment by the sacraments of one sort or another. So in one novel, it may be baptism, in another, it may be marriage, and another, it may be the Eucharist or confession or something like that. And I think he would be right up your alley if you were interested.
Yeah. Which book do you think I should start with from your experience?
So his most Lovecraftian that I've read is Declare, which is a Cold War spy thriller novel. Now, here's the funny thing. I did not love Declare, but it is universally regarded as one of his best by many people that I respect, including Christopher Rocchio. So I'm deferring to their opinion on it and going to say, like, that's a good novel. But if I had to recommend one, it would probably either be let me see here. It would probably be either My Brother's Keeper, which is a take on the Bronte sisters and a werewolf cult, and there's some Lovecraft in that one for sure. But also The Stress of Her Regard, which is more famous, and it's older, and that one's sort of also a pastiche of like gothic horror, like Dracula, and is about the romantic poets being fed on by vampires that have connections to the Nephilim. So I like both of those a good bit. I liked the Anubis Gates. Jordan from iWizard, who I read it with, did not, but I like it a good bit. I think there's some deep stuff there. So yeah, I don't know. There's like 4 of them, but like I like Tim Powers quite a bit, and I think you would as well. So
very good. I'll pick one of those, and it'll be on the fall TBR. I don't know which one or when I'll get to it, but that's whenever a name keeps popping up like that, it's a sign that I need to pay attention. So I went through like just a little bit more personal background. I mean, I really didn't read a whole lot of fiction for about 30 years. I mean, I was in law school, started practicing law, and then went back to grad school, distance studies for ordination in the church, and then continued on in various ways after that. And so I've read smatterings of fiction here and there, but I have a lot. So when I hear guys like you and Britton and others who are half my age, and then everything you've read, I'm like, wow, I've got a lot of catching up to do. So it's good. So another book that you recently reviewed that I've listened to the first few chapters on audiobook and also got it on Kindle is The Cunning Man. And I have a long road trip coming up tomorrow, and so I'm just going to put it in and listen to it. And so that
can't wait.
That's you hit the nail on the head. Again, this is the Mormon Dresden Files. You hit the nail on the head in your review just when the first few chapters. It's nice to have, after Severian and Chris and all the other kind of protagonists we've been talking about. It's nice just to have a wholesome guy, dad. I mean, I love the relationship so far between Hiram and Michael, and I think it's just going to be a great story to listen to.
Well, because that's the exciting thing about Hiram Woolley, and it's bizarre that I even have to say this, but he does not save the day through cutting a head off a monster, slaying the evil sorcerer, outfoxing the wily vizier, or overthrowing the king. Like, Hiram Woolley saves the day by walking in humility, in a contrite spirit before God, in showing love to those who hate him. And like, ultimately, like, that's in those Cunning Man books. Like, that's what saves the day. I'm like, this is bizarre. I have not read a fantasy novel like this, maybe ever. And put on top of that, this is a Mormon who practices like folk magic. Like, people are freaked out by like Harry Potter using made up Latin words for spells, and this is like actual like folk magic that he's writing about. I don't know what to do with these books, but I love them. Like,
yeah, he's using just regular everyday stuff and using it to help people. I think it's basically how is he's being. I think this is a spoiler. It's the first chapter. these Mormon bishops are interrogating him. Like, what are you doing? Why are
Yeah.
you practicing witchcraft? And he's just saying, I'm helping people using stuff. I mean, what? It's just like, would you criticize somebody for helping to heal somebody by making the sign of the cross over them? And it was one of the examples given. No. So I thought, so I'm so glad you brought DJ Butler, and I can't remember the other author's name, to our attention through your review of that, because yeah, what a great story. And by saying, I used the word wholesome before, and I don't mean I want fantasy to go back to Little House on the Prairie,
right?
Or just to pick that as an example of dealing with things in a very non-graphic style. I think that's a good thing about, for the reasons I talked about before, is I think we have to be realistic in dealing with violence and things that go on in this world, because it's real, and that's how we address, from a religious perspective, deal with that question of suffering. But it is nice to at least have some balance in the genre of, it's not all morally gray heroes and those kinds of things. So it was just a nice story to begin. So I'm looking forward to finishing that.
And Hiram Woolley has, and I think this is in the first Cunning Man book, there's a discussion that he has with Michael, where Michael, who's an atheist and a rationalist, is sort of like challenging him on his belief in God, and asking how can a good God that's all powerful allow suffering? And Hiram has a very layman answer, which is like, I'm not a theologian, I don't have all my ducks in a row, but I believe that I'm God's son, and even if I don't know why there's suffering, I believe it's my job to help alleviate it and end as much suffering as I can through kindness and compassion and serving others while I'm here. So even if I don't know why, there's my mission right there, no questions asked. Yes, sir. So, and there's a nobility to that. And anyway, I love that.
That's beautiful. It calls to mind, it's a lovely quote from Mr. Rogers, Saint Fred of our era. When he was asked, well, how do you talk to kids about the violence and suffering and horrible things they see on TV, and he just says, well, look for the helpers. There is goodness that comes out of these situations, and that, of course, that immediately calls back to the Genesis story of Joseph, when Joseph forgives his brothers for trying to kill him and throwing him in the pit and ending up in slavery. Joseph tells him, what you intended for evil, God used for good. And I think that's just a beautiful image. Again, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think you look in the midst of horrible stories, whether fictional or real life, we look for the good that comes out of it. And I think, just another aside, when I hear you and others talk about, what's the series that, so what happens when you get older, names start to, R. Scott Baker.
Yeah, the Second Apocalypse.
No, it sounds interesting because it's well written, but I just don't know if that pure bleakness is just something that I want to, and at my age and the number of book series that I want to get to, I just don't know if that is something that I want to read or not. I don't know. I might at some point at least try it out, but I think I always looked for signs of hope, of meaning beyond, of goodness beyond the circumstance of life, and whatever that may come from.
Yeah. Because
so that's my thought on that anyway.
Well, because to touch on Baker briefly, I'll say, there's a lot of interesting biblical symbolism in there, but most of it is flipped. It's like, oh, here's Jesus, but did you know the Jesus analog is also a rapist and cult leader? It's like, wow, how clever, Baker. So there's some of that. Some of it can come off as very 2005 Reddit atheist. But some of it I do think is interesting. And I actually make the argument that I think Baker's presenting more of an antichrist figure with like things like the deadly wound being healed. So some symbolism that you get from like Revelation. It's called the second apocalypse, rather than trying to make points about Jesus himself. But you're right. Like, there's not much of any hope in the series, and anytime you see like a little bit of hope popping up, it's like crushed down immediately.
Right.
And that's a problem. Like, at least in terms of that being implemented in the real world, because you talked about showing compassion to other people, and when you were talking about Hiram Woolley, and even if you're not a person of faith, like, that's admirable. And the problem is, Jay, that doesn't keep people clicking, and that doesn't keep making us money. And so what it has to be is you either got to stick it to the commies or stick it to the fascists. And if you don't, guess what? The commies are going to burn down your cities, and the fascists are going to take over the government. And if you don't believe me, it's because you're part of the problem. And the world is literally going to burn if you don't hate your neighbor and hate your family members and uninvite them from Thanksgiving, because they literally hate you and everything about your identity. And what is the result? The result is that the people from my generation are more chronically online than they've ever been before, being fed things by algorithms that make them more depressed and more disconnected, and believing things that, if not are outright lies, are at the best half-truths on either side of the political aisle. I worked in politics, so there's a certain amount of it that's like seeing how the sausage is made. That's disgusting.
I was a political science major before I went
Yeah.
to law school, so I have a little bit of experience in that from a long time ago.
But it's like we can't survive like this. Like, you cannot live. You cannot operate as a society believing that half of everyone hates you, and if you don't hate them back, like, they are literally going to kill you, which keeps people clicking, keeps people in fear. And so that's the argument that the algorithms, much of the news media, tell people. Sorry, not to get on the soapbox.
That's and it's not just your generation. I'm on the older side of Gen X, and I look at people my age and baby boomers and stuff that gets shared, on social media. And it's just exacerbated with the what they call it AI slop, stuff that just gets created and propagated out there, just sharing it without thinking. And I think we need to just go back to just some basic critical thinking skills here, people. Yeah. And tie it back into this kind of fictional writing that we're getting into here. I think that what the best of these science fiction and fantasy authors are, they are teaching us to think, in addition to exposing us to another world that they've created.
Right.
By whether it's whether it's through the metaphors that they're using, or the symbolism, or through just direct one-on-one allegory type stuff, whatever it might be. If the more we think about what we're doing to ourselves, that's a good thing, because I think we can't ignore it. We have to address this stuff head on. Absolutely.
And you, coming from a contemplative tradition, will probably know this more than anyone, but one of the number one biblical principles, and it's not just a biblical, like, this is a life principle, but the Bible emphasizes this over and over and over again, is that the one that you give your ear to is the one that you are that is your master. And so, like, that's why there's this weird biblical law about, guess what? If the bondservant wants to say with the master in the Old Testament, you bring him to the door and you pierce his ear, and he has a pierced ear. And it's because the one that owns your ear is the one that owns you. Okay. Like, we're talking about symbolism. Like, there's a symbolic reason for this. And in a similar way, guess what? If you give your ear to the AI, even if it's not AI, like, I get people will dispute that, but even if it's not the AI, if you give it to what Mark Zuckerberg and Instagram and Facebook want to show you, and remember, they will show you more and more fringe and extreme things of this to keep you either outraged or to keep showing you just more of what you want to see. They're owning you. They're owning your mind because they're owning your ear. and in the case of reading, we could say your eyes as well. And so there's some wisdom to the little kid song of "Be careful, little ears, what you hear," and I don't know. I would see it, even if you're going to intellectually disagree with R. Scott Baker or intellectually disagree with H.P. Lovecraft. It is a much better use of your time to spend an hour, 3 hours, 20 hours reading something, thinking about it, processing it, taking time to journal about it. God forbid we actually pick up a pen and write something down rather than type it out on our phone. That's a better, anyway. And now, once again, I'm monologuing here, but that's better than giving your ear to an algorithm that literally just wants to use you for dollars, that wants to make you the product.
And I think that, thank you. And I know this wasn't the point of what you were saying, but I think you exposed the flaw in my own reasoning as to why I said, well, I don't think I want to read R. Scott Baker. I think that, again, even though I may not appreciate the worldview that it sounds like he's created in it, it nevertheless will be getting me to think and to analyze. Because I know the question of the will is a huge part of that. And I think the more that I can do to understand my own assumptions and my own background, and because that's exactly what the echo chambers that are being created,
right? Yep,
are becoming increasingly tight. I mean, you can be pigeonholed in this niche by our social groups and our social media algorithms and all these things. So, yeah, that's I maybe I'll read Baker too at some point. No, yeah. So how I think that, a topic for another day perhaps, but again, I think that's a thing that we can ponder, contemplate more, is how fantasy, science fiction, speculative fiction, horror, literature in general can get us out of this death spiral that we seem to be entering into, without just being able to even talk to our neighbors,
right?
Less love our neighbors as ourselves,
right?
So that's an interesting point, because one of the purposes of reading, whether it's spiritual literature or other literature, that is to think, to be drawn into something greater than yourself.
Yes. Yep.
In spiritual reading, we call it the analogical sense of Scripture, anagogical, excuse me. That's, you're being drawn into something greater. What is the meaning that you are being that is arising out of your heart or your senses as you're perceiving these words. And so, the more we read, the more we dialogue. And I think maybe I know there's been lots of talk lately on BookTube, and I've stayed out of this stuff about why we do BookTube. I'm a new BookTuber. I have only got, a limited number of subscribers, and that's so I don't have much to say about that. But I think why I'm on BookTube is because of conversations like this, because I'm watching other people's perspectives on these genres and these stories that we love. Even if we may not love every story or like every book we read, everything we do changes us. Our go back to my $50 theology word, our ontology, our being changes a little bit by everything that we. If you are what you eat, well, you also are what you read. And so, I think the more we ingest, not in the Alzabean way, to go back to Wolfe, the more we can ingest, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, because you're right. Like, we've gotten to the place now where, let's say hypothetically, there was a controversial war going on in the Middle East right now, hypothetically. And let's say hypothetically that the information that's being fed about it is so varied and of such difference in terms of the set of facts that people are receiving is not just like, oh, different perspectives. It's literally opposite things that people are being told. So much so, because you talked about getting stuck in the echo chamber, that if I stay on this, and I stay on this, like scrolling, and I'm not engaging in questioning my beliefs, in hearing somebody out, in hearing out my neighbors. Forget loving my neighbors. You know, Jesus says, love my enemies. I'm like, I don't even like my neighbors. How can I even love my enemies? It's gotten to the point where I literally believe, like, people will literally believe, and I can as well, that people who disagree with me on something like a global conflict that everyone is being fed lies to about, literally thinks that their neighbor is evil because they're unwilling to question what they're being fed. And so, and I'm not here to make a statement one way or another on that. I think I'm too young or ignorant to have anything worth saying on that, other than to say, I think it's important for me and and probably everyone else to be quicker to hear and slower to speak. And I don't know, if for no other reason than just listening to other people's perspectives, like you said, that's part of why I'm here on BookTube and like talking to people, both people of a similar mindset, but also hearing people who come from maybe a different tradition, and even authors like people have picked on like Christopher Rocky is a big fan of Gene Wolfe, and people have picked on him of like, oh, you like him just because he's Catholic. And it's like, well, I like both of them, and I'm not Catholic. You know, like I'm a reluctant Protestant, so like, you know, what you gonna do there?
Right.
But I do appreciate even authors that I disagree with, hearing their worldview, hearing their perspective, and questioning if maybe I'm wrong about something, because I guarantee you that I am. Anyway, this turned into the Night of Sam's monologue. So
that's preach it, brother. Preach it. maybe that's your, you know, I went into ministry at age 40, so there's time.
There you go. So Jay, if I've got one last question for you, but I want to ask before I get to that, if you have any thoughts on that before we put a bow on the hearing people out, other perspectives topic.
What, again, I did a 2-year training in spiritual direction from Benedictine sisters, and I've been a spiritual director then for about 10 years, in addition to being a pastor. So I'm seeing people that aren't necessarily part of my church and just come to see me and for guidance. And the number one thing that we learn in that is listen. You don't our story matters, but sometimes we just have to listen. And so we don't always have to interject our own opinions, and immediately when we hear somebody else's story, immediately respond with, well, that may have happened to you, but guess what happened to me? One up somebody through that cycle of stories that we see, conversations that we go on to. And I go back, if I can leave one, there is one Bible passage that I think is instructive. It's really probably one of my favorite parts of the Bible. It's 1 Kings 19. It's a story of Elijah being on the run from Jezebel, and he's in the cave. And past the cave is the earthquake and the fire and the wind. But God wasn't any of those things. God was in the still small voice, according to the King James translation, or the sound of sheer silence. Sometimes, again, whether you call it God, the divine, whatever, sometimes we just got to get out of the noise, whether it's our phones or whatever's going on out there, and just be part of that silence to experience something other than ourselves. Here endeth the sermon. What's your
Amen? There you go. So Jay, as we bring it to a close here, we've talked about your taste for symbolic stories, but also that in science fiction and fantasy. So if you had to recommend something that's maybe not something everybody's heard of or would expect to be like symbolically deep, to like both myself, but just generally people who are watching, what would that be?
That's a good question. In the in of any kind of literature, or what, science
Sure.
fiction, fantasy, or what? Or,
It could be both.
what would I pick there? I'm going to go back, and you've heard me, and I think you even picked up the book series you mentioned in one of your videos about it. I think just a series that I find very endearing, that's categorized for some reason as YA at this point, is the Chronicles of Prydain.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in the process, again, that's a series that I had way back in the day. I'm rereading it now. I finished 2 of the books. And I think they're very easy to read. They're very simple stories. That's probably why they do get categorized as YA. But I think, just to go along the lines of things we've talked about, you've got this kid who's not perfect, Taran, the pig keeper. He messes up. He admits to it. He beats himself up over it. But then the first book just has this incredible act of mercy that I think, and then it comes around to play a role later in the story. And so I think, it's wonderful to read the kind of the deeper books that make your brain hurt, like we've talked about. But it was also refreshing just to go back to that story and just read a story about, again, a good character, not in the same sense as Hiram Woolley, but a kid who doesn't have special powers, isn't the chosen one, just tries to do the right thing, and is put into difficult circumstances, and cares about others, and has mercy and sacrifices himself for others. And so I would just go back to that one, as I think anybody can read that and enjoy it.
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, like you said, I picked up the set, so I look at that, and they're all relatively small books. I'm like, oh, I should be able to hit all 5 of these in a couple of weeks if I really pressed in. So
you probably could.
Yeah. No. Well, thanks for sharing that, Jay. Thanks for letting me take up almost an hour and a half of your time as we're recording this on a Sunday evening. I really appreciate it. I like I said, I love the work that you do on your channel, so I hope you keep doing it for a long time. And to my viewers who haven't subscribed to a Contemplative Reader, do so. It's like my stuff, but better and deeper. So I appreciate what you do there.
Well, I appreciate your work very much, Sam, and I enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Yeah, and Jay is going to be reading, let me see if I can get this right, the Gormenghast books with Philip Chase coming up. So
no date set, but yep, it's on our long distance TBR. I'll be doing a buddy read on that.
Yeah. So you got to subscribe to see him read Gormenghast with Philip Chase, which I mean that'd be a pay to see event, honestly. So all right, well, thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Take care.